and telling us exactly what the scene is out there in the environmental community as of right now. Paul?
Thank you and good morning. You have my admiration. Anybody who can function at this time of the morning is certainly a better person than I am. This morning I'd like to give you a little overview of where we came from, some initiatives we put in place, some of the results we've seen thus far, and then give you some benchmarks by which you may want to measure progress in the future in the environmental area. And I've got some slides to help do this. Let's see if we can get them going. In '88, when the Romer administration took over, we were faced with a couple of things. One of them scared me the most was that toxic release inventory data had just come out showing Louisiana first in the nation in total toxics. That's toxic chemicals that list the 300 that released to the air, land, and water. But at the same time, we had a ranking of state environmental programs by a group in Washington that ranked all states, and we came out 50th. Here we were, first in pollution, dead last in quality of environmental programs. It's not a good scenario. And it motivated me and I think some of my staff to do things that we probably may not have done otherwise. Cooperation.
This one?
All right.
Okay.
Have my training course now. This is the same data shown another way. You can see the top states there. That's the ones in red. And per square mile is a better indication of risk to the people. You've got a lot of concentrated pollution in concentrated in a small area like we have in Louisiana, then the situation is worse. And in a place like Texas, where it may be spread out over a larger area. We also were first or second in underground injection. And in case you're thinking, well, these chemicals are not harmful, they are. Many of them are carcinogenic, that is cancer-causing. And in measuring only the cancer-causing chemicals, we're also in the top. At least in the top 5, we're probably in the top 1 or 2. At the same time, the quality of the programs, as I mentioned, was at an all-time low, as was funding and staffing. And I think those two things go hand in hand. You can't solve all the problems by throwing money at it, but it's pretty clear that without adequate funding, you're not going to have good environmental programs. You've just got to have people, you've got to have the facilities, you've got to have the equipment to do the job. And we didn't have it. There were 15 PCs at the DEQ when I got there. 15. This is an agency that's very technical, hires only college graduates in science to do the technical work, and they didn't have the tools of the trade. We started a number of initiatives. One of them came up fairly early, was the Calcium estuary cleanup, found hexachlorobutadiene, hexachlorobenzene in the sediments and in the fish, and put out signs saying, eat at your own risk. That essentially did end the local fisheries, which is unfortunate but necessary in this particular case. That cleanup is underway now. It'll be many years before it's completed, but at least it's begun. Shell dredging has been stopped in Lake Pontchartrain. The impacts to the bottom of the lake were excessive, and that's what we said, and that's no longer going on. We were number one also in the amount of hazardous waste received into the state from other states, primarily because we have the most capacity of any state in the nation. We have, at that time, we had 5 commercial facilities, not even counting marine shale. Now we have 4. One of them has been denied a permit. And where the capacity is where the waste is going to go. So we decided to raise the tax. You can do like Alabama and start trying to pass laws, but you run smack dab into the Interstate Commerce Clause. That is, you can't restrict movement of waste across state borders under the Constitution. So we raised the tax. In fact, it's up by a factor of 8 for some kinds of waste, and that has had an effect. This is what the hazardous waste movement has done. It's been dropping since '88. '88 was when the first tax was passed. We passed another tax in '90, and it's down now. I don't know where we rank among the states, but this is a good sign. There is a risk to people in Louisiana dealing with this waste. The risk comes from transportation, it comes from things that may come out of the stack, it comes from the handling, it comes from groundwater contamination, and all of those things have happened in Louisiana. So it's a real concern. We did a tax exemption program, and I'll explain later why these sorts of programs are important. This particular one tied tax exemptions, that is, of the $400 or so million a year we granted exemptions to companies, we've conditioned some of that on environmental compliance and on an emissions to job ratio. This is the environmental compliance slide. It just says that if you've had penalties in the past, you lost some points. And if your emissions were very high compared to the number of jobs you had, you also lost some points. But ultimately, all companies got 90% or above, almost all companies. The average for chemical companies, which are the ones that have high emissions and low jobs, relatively speaking, those are the ones that did worse, and they averaged in 90%. They didn't like it much. I don't think they liked the precedent. But in fact, it had a very interesting effect. And now we estimate that some 40 million pounds of reductions came about because of this program. I think this is one that's on the chopping block. The budget, as you know, went up. And in '88, it was 16.3 million when you subtract out some of the funds that aren't really programmatic funds. And to carry that analysis through, you find in '92 we're up to about 60 million. So it's about a 3-fold increase, roughly. And the size of the agency has increased also. The number of employees when I got there was about 350, the head count, and it's about 8.25 now. Of those new people, we put at least 100 of them into, a little over 100, into enforcement and surveillance. These are people that are out in the field that send in reports that ultimately lead to enforcement actions. And we've got 90% increase in the number of people in enforcement. That is reflected in the number of penalties, the dollar amounts of penalties. And this is what the dollar amounts have done. The '89 anomaly there is accounted for by marine shale, which had about $3 million in penalties by itself. This has led to some accomplishments, and I want to share some of those with you. Accomplishments are a little mixed up with initiatives, but one of the things we've done is get people recycling. And that follows this theme of the way to deal with waste of any kind is to reduce the volume, number one. Number two, you recycle as much as possible. Number three, you treat it. Number four, you dispose of it. So disposal is now the fourth option. Permits are for disposal, essentially. We're handing out permits to people to dispose of their waste into the air, land, and water. But before we do that, we ought to be running through this scenario and saying how much you reduced, how much you're recycling, how much you treated it, before we grant those permits, and that's increasingly happening. This is the recycling of solid waste, and as you know, we granted a permit for East Baton Rouge just last week, and that was really the first brand new permit for a landfill, because we're in a closing down landfill scenario. We're not in a position of granting a whole bunch of new permits. Many of the existing ones don't meet standards, and they're going to have to be closed down. But the way to deal with them is to deal with solid waste, to recycle as much as you can, and then what you can't recycle, you put in a regional landfill. The standards now, the technical standards for building landfills are much more stringent and costly. Therefore, it takes a certain volume before you can afford them. That means you have to move toward regional landfills where half a dozen parishes or so might share a single landfill. And that's happening throughout the state. this is the good news. Looks like with Shreveport and Jefferson Parish online, within the next month or so, we're going to be up to about 500,000 households. That's a good number. It's probably close to half the number of households in the state. And because of people like Susan, who's here today, we can see these kinds of results, and that's excellent. There's also great teaching going on, environmental education, when people begin recycling. They realize we create waste too. Everyone has a certain amount of waste that we have to create in order to live. And I'm going to do my best to keep those wastes at a minimum, and recycling is a way to do that. So we have found, and other states have found, that the amount of littering goes down when you have recycling programs. And there's no apparent connection there. But in fact, I think the connection is in people's minds. And they no longer litter if they're recycling. Oops. Backwards on that. One of the accomplishments, and this took 3 years, is that we dropped from number 1 in total toxic releases to number 2. And we are behind Texas now. Texas is way out in front. In fact, if you follow the numbers through here, I'll show you, we hope to drop down to about 200 million pounds by the end of the decade, maybe even sooner, assuming these programs are kept in place. And we may even drop out of the top 10, which is kind of astounding. I never thought we could do that. And that's assuming that the other states aren't making great strides. Some of them might be, but at least I think we'll be dropping each year further and further down this list, and that's good news. This is a little bit hard to read, but it's trying to show you its decreases. So the longest bars on there are the ones that have decreased the most. And of all the states in the top 10, Louisiana has done the best in decreasing its total toxic emissions. This is air emissions, and again, what we're showing you is decreases, and the colors don't stand out very well, but Louisiana in white there is showing you one of the greatest decreases in air emissions. Air hasn't shown the drop that we've seen in other areas, discharges to land, discharges to water, because air is probably more technologically complex and it's harder to do. We've seen about a 25% drop in air toxics, and we expect that to increase in the years coming, because the air toxic emission law and the regulations are just kicking in as of last month. So we expect great improvements in the area of air. Here's all that information on one kind of hard to read chart, but for instance, air is on the bottom, and the different years are shown in 87 in blue up to 90 in purple. And you can see decreases in every category. Injection is the greatest, has had the greatest decrease. That's because a number of companies are phasing out injection wells. Shell is one of them. One of the biggest discharges in Louisiana is a plant in Fortier, I think it's Fortier, up around New Orleans, and they're getting out of injection wells also. They're actually making a product and selling it. And that total is about 48% of toxics. Now, I'm talking about toxics because toxics is what we have the most information on because of the federal law, the Toxic Release Inventory. But all across the board, we're seeing reductions in other chemicals also, not just toxics. One sign of that, I think, is the fact that this past year we had 8 exceedances for ozone in the Baton Rouge area, whereas the year before we had 13. Now, that's not enough data for me to be conclusive, but it's enough for me to tell you we're moving in the right direction. Thus far, what I've been telling you and giving, the data I've been giving you to you is reported data. This is coming from various companies telling us what they're emitting. So that's emissions data reported to the state. Now you could say, well, it could be wrong. They could all be lying. I don't believe that's the case. This is a completely independent set of data. This is from DEQ's own monitors. We're out there monitoring the air all the time. And this is the kind of trend we see. And this particular one is total hydrocarbons. And so the toxic chemicals would be bound up in this total hydrocarbons. And the trends are down there also. And that's good news. We chose one particular chemical, benzene, and we're showing you the parts per billion by volume in the air on the left over time, and that's an enormous decrease in the amount of benzene. It's come about for a number of reasons. We've got controls on barge loading now. We've got controls on the stacks. We've got controls on what's called black hole reboilers or black hole dehydrators, which is something the gas companies were using to take water out of gas pipelines, and there were hundreds of them across the state. Turns out they were pumping out enormous amounts of benzene, and they've changed their operation now, and that's been stopped. So this independent data tells the same story. The concentration of chemicals in the air is dropping, as we would expect it, because we've been hearing from the emission data that it's dropping. Now, there's a number of reasons for these toxics reductions. One is this toxics release inventory. That's the TRI that the feds do. And that's very good. The thing that Louisiana has done that's gone beyond that, and there are people in New Orleans today talking about this, is that Louisiana has taken that data and made it available to people. When it comes out from the feds, it's in a big, thick book, and the best way to hide anything that I know of is to put in a big, thick book full of graphs and charts and tables and lists that nobody really wants to read, and you've got to really poke and be trained to get what you need from that. So we took it and modeled it for Louisiana and gave you the Louisiana numbers by parish, by city, by everywhere we could cut the data. And I think that's had an enormous effect. It's the power of information. But the information has to be available, and that's what's important. We presented things like this. This is one way to cut the data. For the top parishes with the top emissions, and this is probably the top 10, I guess. We also show you the companies that are responsible for those emissions. This is from their own data, so nobody disagrees with it. Might be a little embarrassing, but it's the sort of thing that gets companies' attention. We have heard from this result and something else we do called corporate emission, the stories about the CEO in New York calling down wanting to know why they're on the list. They'd never heard from the CEO before. And all of a sudden, the CEO began getting letters saying his company was on the list and he didn't like it. And that has led to reductions probably as great as anything else we've done. We also cut the chemicals this way. We call it chemicals of special interest. These are the ones we think are most of concern. And we'll give you a color-coded map showing you which parishes have various amounts of those chemicals. The corridor along the Mississippi River stands out. Obviously, northern Louisiana is primarily paper mill emissions and other things. Paper mills lead the list. Legislation is one of the reasons that we have this reduction in toxic emissions and in all those other chemicals. And let me give you a little lesson in how the DEQ functions. And this is what I call the command and control system, or the regulatory system. This is the traditional way to regulate pollutants. And that is, you pass a law, that's the box on the left, that creates the authority to do the job. And then assuming you've got staff and money and a functioning agency, then you promulgate rules. And just yesterday I counted up the rules that we promulgated, the sets of rules that we promulgated in the last 4 years, and it's 81. I thought it was in the 60s, I now find it's 81 sets. There's never been, there weren't 81 sets in place when I got there, much less than that. So we more than doubled the number of sets of rules. That's very bureaucratic. I don't even like to talk about it, except that if you don't have rules in place, you cannot enforce the law. You will be beat in court. And occasionally we are, because the rules weren't there to do the job that had to be done. The Administrative Procedures Act says we have to give anyone we regulate a reasonable understanding of how the system works. And that's what the rules do. They tell you how the law is going to be carried out. Then, based on those rules, and sometimes those rules contain standards, as in our air toxics bill, as in our new water rules, we issue permits. Those permits are monitored by people in the surveillance division, that's the field guys. And then finally, if somebody misses or exceeds their permit limits, then we assign a penalty. And then beyond that, they can ask for an appeal, and you probably remember all those battles about how many levels of appeal do we have, and should we have. We have 4 now, and each year we have to beat down bills and try to push us into a 5th level. It takes a year. If I put a $10 penalty on someone, it will take me a year to collect that. And if I issue a compliance order saying, please close the valve because it's leaking into the river, that can be appealed, and a year later that leaking valve still could be leaking, because by then, it takes that long to get through that due process. To their credit, many companies, they will shut the valve without waiting for that appeal to be exhausted, but some don't. And that's an enormous problem in Louisiana. The Law Institute is studying it right now and trying to figure out how to reconcile this due process argument with some expediency in government. If government can't move fast, then it loses its effectiveness. And one of the first things I learned when I went out to talk to my field people 4 years ago was that when they went back to a plant and there had been no action from their inspection of the previous year on a recommended enforcement penalty, plant people just laugh at it and say, well, why should we listen to you if DEQ's not doing anything? In Baton Rouge, we haven't got any action out of them on this penalty that was assigned a year ago. And so you lose credibility, you lose enforcement capability. And then the field people just stop doing the job. And there's not enough supervisors in the world for us to watch over every one of them. So they have to want to do the job, they have to know they're being effective, and that doesn't happen if you have this huge drawn-out appeals process, which we do now. That's how you improve the command and control system. Have better laws, expanded regulations, tighter permits, and increased surveillance and increased enforcement should be on there. And we've done all that. That's one type of way to control pollution. You have to have this system, it's in the law, but if you don't go beyond that, you won't do very much of a job. You'll do a mediocre job at best. You've got to go to other things. You've got to go to the programs I've been talking about, which are outside the law. One is publishing the toxics release inventory. Another is corporate response, where we publish the names of the 12 companies with the highest emissions to air, land, and water. You've got to have things like the Leap to 2000 project, which begins to pull together consensus on what are the biggest problems we have to deal with. Those sorts of programs which go beyond the command and control system are the important ones, in my opinion. And that scorecard we did, that led to enormous reductions. Corporate Challenge is the one I mentioned, where we published the 12 top emitters to air, land, and water. That's the one where CEOs are calling down from New York or Houston, wherever, saying, what do you mean we're on this list? In fact, I heard that Mr. Grace himself called plant manager W.R. Grace, who had never heard from Mr. Grace. And you want to know why he's on the list. And now they're working very hard to get off that list. That's an important approach, and it doesn't cost anything. It's a simple thing to do. It may be embarrassing to someone, but it's got to be done. This is what we estimate out into the future based on those corporate response. So this is the 3 lists of the 12 largest emitters each. And if you'll notice, the total down there in 95, we think if everybody complies with the reductions that they're promised, it's going to be below 200 million pounds. Well, that 200 million is going to drop us out of the top 10, if indeed that occurs. That's why I think that we're going to be dropping every year on those lists. And we may even get out of the top 10, though that's probably a little high in the sky at this particular point. Well, what happens next? Number of things. This Leap to 2000 project, which some of you may have worked on, was first for Louisiana, and pulled together all the interest groups we knew that had an interest in our environmental problems. And we had 54 interest groups serving on this thing, and they harangued each other for a year and finally settled down and began working and established some relationships, and maybe they trust each other. And Romer signed an executive order continuing this, and under the law, his executive orders are effective until the end of the next legislative session, 60 days after the next legislative session. So this will continue, and it's just a talking mechanism. Let's see if we can't agree on what our problems are and then move beyond that and find some solutions. And it's worked very well. These are the top 10 issues they've identified that they're saying the state ought to be putting its environmental money into to solve these. And as you know, we've done things in most of these areas. Obviously, there's more that could be done. Here's some benchmarks, some things I think we ought to be watching over the next few years to see what happens. Enforcement is an important one. There wasn't much enforcement in '88 when we took over. One of the reasons was that there was one hearing officer, and somebody asked for a hearing, essentially that bogged the whole process down. So penalty was never assessed, or collectible was assessed, never collected. And that creates bad morale in the department. It creates a situation where the inspectors don't want to go out and do their jobs. Second thing is recycling. We want to make sure that continues on its way, and it's doing very well now. Third is to watch these hazardous waste transfers, that is the movement of hazardous waste in and from outside of Louisiana, and see that that continues the way it's already moving, which is downward. And toxic reductions, obviously we've got to watch that. We're looking for reductions in all chemicals discharged to the environment. Toxics is what we have the data for, so it's the one that's going to be the best indicator for us. Funding, you can't do the job without funding. Funding's not all you need, but you can't do it without funding. And that chart on the top shows what has happened with funding over the last few years. That's state general funds. DEQ generates most of its own funds. Of that 60 million, about 48 is generated by the DEQ from various sources, federal fines and penalties, fees, and the remainder, 10 or 12, comes out of the state general fund. If it drops below 13.5 is what's needed for continuation next year. 13.5 million in the state general fund. If it drops below that, DEQ is not going to be functioning at the level it ought to be functioning, and they may even have to lay people off. Number of personnel is critical. Can't do the job without people, and you can see there on that chart what has happened there. Those things are easy to follow. That's all public information. Oops, backwards. All right, we have a light, please. That's the story of where we were, how we got to where we are now, and what we want to watch for the future. I'd be glad to answer any questions you may have. Let me say that's the story as I understand it. Any questions? Blown you away completely. Yes, Randy.
I just want to make a comment about the toxic police inventory that the state puts out. I recently received a copy, I guess, within the last couple of months. And it's the best one that's come out so far, and it's one of the finest documents I've ever seen produced by any government agency anywhere in terms of its fairness, its clarity, and the information value. I urge each and every one of you, if you're interested in that sort of thing, to make sure you get a copy of it. And hopefully we'll be continuing to do this year after year. Congratulations, you're doing a great job.
Thank you. By the way, let me expand a little bit on that. Watch those 4 programs that I mentioned. One is that TRI data where we report on what's happening in Louisiana from the national data. The other is that corporate challenge. The third is the Leap to 2000. The fourth is the scorecard. Those 4 themselves probably have led to as many reductions as that command and control system where we write the permits and sort of jawbone people into reductions. If those are all abandoned, you can expect that the progress you've seen thus far is going to at least level off, maybe begin to go the other way. But some of those programs take some courage. It takes political courage to do those things because the people that are named on those lists don't like being named. They tend to bring pressure wherever they can to change that. We'll see what happens. Paul? Adriana?
Yeah, I've been sort of troubled in the last few weeks about a lot of the press and the problems that some people perceive with the new administration and the appointees at DEQ. No matter who that has been appointed, we're going to have to work with these folks, and I really see potential for a lot of problems with a lot of bashing of people who we haven't given a chance yet prior to their taking office that may complicate our ability to be able to work with these people. We're going to have to work with them closely. And I just like your comments on, what do you think, how do you think that's going to impact those of us who try to deal with DEQ a good bit if we alienate or have alienated people at the higher level positions in the agency? How is that going to impact our ability to work with the legislature to hopefully continue to have committees that incorporate people in the industrial community as well as people in the environmental community seated at the same table to try to come up with regulations that are going to impact everyone. Sort of a sense of community and cooperation that I think has been prevalent for the last couple of years especially. And I think we made a lot of progress because of that. And I really have a good deal of concern about us drawing a line in the sand now and being polarized again, everybody pointing fingers to the other side. And I think I'm afraid we're gonna move backwards. And I don't think, I mean, this is our state, I think we all have a vested interest in it. And I think we all need to agree to try to continue to work together.
Like you, I think it's, I would take the soft approach. I think criticism is premature. And you've got to give folks a chance to do their job and see how they do. If 6 months from now you've got reasons for complaining, then complain all you want, but it's too early. They've got to be given a chance to do the job. Yes?
The figures that you show and that kind of report that you've given us, is DEQ required to do that every year with those kind of reports that we can easily, readily
No.
access, or is that just something you do?
No, they're not required to do so. It's something we did because we thought the information was valuable. And it's something people ought to know. It's your air, it's your water, your land. And you ought to know what the data is saying about this thing. So we made a big effort to get the information out. Often in agencies, the tendency is to hide your head in the sand. Don't put out bad information because it reflects badly on you. Well, that's the wrong approach. If you do that, then when you go to the legislature, you've got no justification for asking for a budget increase or doing any of the other new things that you have to do. I think you've got to lay out the information, let the public judge, interpret it as best you can, but just give them the information. The public's pretty clever. This whole business about leave it to the experts is wrong. The public is very good at interpreting what's going on. And generally, in polls that are done, they're almost right on target. So I tend to believe the more information, the better out there for people to choose about what's really going on. We're all going to be better off for that. And that's what an open government is all about, and that's why you need an open DEQ. Thank you. Yes, one more.
Do you suspect that the agency will continue to solicit work groups with industry working with the DEQ, like the ozone task force, online monitoring, things of that nature in the future?
I certainly hope so. I think that will continue. Yeah, that's the, I think it's the coming thing. It's already here. We call it negotiated rulemaking. The EPA is using it more and more. The alternative is strife and fighting and winding up in court, and courts take years and years and years to decide issues. It's better if we all sit around the table and see if we can come to agreement. We often have to agree that we can't agree and move off, and then fight in the political arena or the public arena or some other arena. But the first thing to do is complicated sets of regulations that's going to affect a lot of people is to have groups sit down and try to work it out. Now, we've been doing that for years, and we did it on air toxics, we did it on solid waste, we did it on recycling, we're doing it in lots of other areas. It doesn't always work, and it's a burden on the agency because it takes much longer to do it that way. And I've had 3 committees working on solid waste regs. The last version just came out. We still couldn't promulgate because there was still too much disagreement. So it doesn't always work, but it's the first thing you have to try. It does mean it takes longer, but maybe we've got the time to do that. I think it's constructive use of our time. So yeah, I think that will continue. I don't see how it can go any other direction. And it calls upon people to try and work constructively at solving these problems. It puts a big burden on everyone. It's time consuming, all the complaints. But it's important that we do it that way. That's why I like to leave to 2000. For 2 years, people sat around trying to resolve these issues, and they finally did come to an agreement. And now we have a general consensus we ought to move forward. By the way, of those 54 interest groups, 53 signed the document saying these are the issues, here's some general approaches to solving the problem, here's a vision for Louisiana. So it's the first time we have that. And it's useful. It's the sort of thing that ought to be used more in the future. Thank you, folks.
I want to again thank Paul on behalf of everybody in Louisiana for a cleaner, better, brighter future than I think we've had in a long time. Thank you very much, Paul, from all of us. Back to business. I do not yet know who the speaker is going to be next month, but we'll be finding out sometime soon. I ask you again to make sure you've signed in on the yellow pad. We're always, as you know, revising our mailing list. We're passing the suggestion box. I think it's on the table in the middle. If you have anybody that you'd like to have us have as a speaker in the coming months, please make sure to put it in the suggestion box. And do we have any events for the environmental calendar? That's going to be a quiet environmental coming up month. The environmental idea of the month is, and I guess it's really coming from what Paul said, maybe it's time to try to get DEQ to put out the kind of information that we've heard this morning. I think it would be nice for us to learn what our future is going to be year from year to year. I thank you all for coming.